Hello there, and welcome to The Value of Everything. I'm pleased to have back my guest, Michael Acuña. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me back, Charles. I appreciate it.
This episode is really going to be us covering the year 2017, and we'll just look ahead with how we see things panning out for 2018. Now, as a quick summary of the year, how would you define it in a few words?
I think the big story of 2017 was the relatively unexpected rise in populist sentiments, both left and right, around the world, and the implications that has for politics moving forward.
Right. Yeah, I guess from my side, I think it's definitely a year of divisions. Divisions and bubbles, I think, is probably like the year of 2017 for me.
Sure, yeah.
All right. So, what area do you want to sort of focus on first that you think is quite relevant?
I guess we could begin with what I had briefly mentioned, which was the political divisions that have emerged that are a definitive break from the sort of centrism that's characterized preceding decades, where it was really predictable in terms of how countries were going to be voting and what the implications were. Now, the establishment is suffering from a legitimation crisis, and it just seems to be getting worse each day. And by establishment, I don't just mean the political establishment, but also the media establishment, major institutions, sort of cornerstones of civil society.
Right. And with Marxism, is there an analysis of these progression points before a crash happens in the political spectrum?
Oh yeah, one of the fundamental assumptions of Marxism is that the instability of capitalism is going to inevitably give rise to a ideological legitimation crisis where you start seeing these divisions emerge. They become very stark, and then they can lead anywhere depending on how bad the economy gets. So it's economics that are precipitating all of this in the background, and then in the foreground what you see is new political lines being drawn, new conflicts ensuing. So that's really part of a Marxist materialism, and we always incorporate that into our analyses of these sort of phenomena.
Say you spoke to somebody who is in the media or something like that. They'll come back to you right now and they say, "But hold on a minute here. The Dow's at all-time highs. What's the problem?"
Right. I think that has a lot to do with monetary policy since the crisis happened. So, yeah, it's true that the stock market is booming in the United States and elsewhere, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that financial institutions are borrowing at historic lows, and they're not necessarily lending that money out to businesses or consumers, but they are using it to buy stocks and to speculate. And that is going to be great for Wall Street for a little while until the fundamentals catch up with them. So what I'm seeing is just a delay in the inevitable, which is another correction, and if you want to call it that, in the business cycle.
Right.
The speculation is just a symptom of that. I don't think the fundamentals, which as a Marxist, and you and I discussed this a lot, is the rate of profit. That hasn't been restored, and all of this speculative bonanza can only be pushed so far.
Right. So when we look back at the year, is it reaching the crisis point now, or is it still going to continue on, do you think?
It's always risky trying to guess when things are finally going to catch up. I mean, the government does a really great job kicking the can down the road when it comes to fiscal and monetary policy. They can delay things for years sometimes. So it's really difficult to predict when the crash is going to happen. I mean, I personally, I'm of the view that we never recovered from the 2008 crash. It's what we're seeing is just a different manifestation of it. So we're seeing bubbles emerge here and there that are keeping employment steady and fueling Wall Street speculation.
So really,
But
yeah. So really, there's division and there's disconnection, and we've covered this point a lot throughout 2017, where there's this great big disconnect of everyone saying, "Oh, the stock market's doing better than ever." There's the growth projections for next year is another, I don't know, 5% rate increase in GDP. Yet everybody that you talk to is like, nobody's doing much better. Everyone seems to be doing a little bit worse than last year. The other thing you always notice is that you only hear really good news stories from people. When people lose their jobs, you don't really hear that often. But I'm pretty sure that if you do dig around, you will find a lot of kind of stories where people are on the edge of real survival. They have maxed out on credit cards. They don't know where they're going to pay for the next meal from. There's this giant disconnect which is getting gradually wider and wider, and I think this is part of where the breakdown of the media is happening as well, where they're just big advocates of the Dow and pumping things and everything's rosy. This might be also another problem with Donald Trump as well, where he's just saying, look at me, the Dow is at the highest point ever, this is all to do with me, things are great. But I still don't think anything's really solved. He hasn't necessarily put in, like, he's done a few things, tax incentives here and there, but it doesn't necessarily span into the real economy, the actual productive economy, the actual people learning a skill and really making something in the world, rather than the people just are on this survival mode at the moment.
yeah, that's right. I mean, if you really start looking at the data so with sober senses, as it were, what you find is that while unemployment is low, the kinds of employment we have are qualitatively worse than it had been.
Yeah.
So there's more people that are participating in the labor market, but they're working lower quality jobs. They're working 2 or 3 jobs to get by. If you look at the data for the United States, more than half of the working population are just one unexpected event away from being destitute. So if they have a serious accident or injury or what have you, that alone would be enough to, really jeopardize their economic standing.
Yeah.
And that applies to so many people. That's why people have a sense of dissatisfaction with the way things are going. And politicians and the media have a vested interest in making things sound much better than they are. And the reason why is because this has to do again with Wall Street. If it sounds good, that's going to encourage further speculation on the market, and that's going to fuel the rising prices we see across the board in stock values.
Yeah, interestingly, with what you say there, I mean, obviously, if you spoke to most people in finance as well, they'll jokingly say, yeah, the stock markets are doing really well and everything's going so rosy, but all they're doing is they know that there's going to be a crash coming around pretty soon, but they're just riding the tide of, it's going up, there's this greater ascension, there's probably more debt that's being pumped into the system, companies are giving their shareholders more shares but actually adding more debt onto their books. It's going to come down eventually. Everyone's got this sort of a persona mind and what they're really thinking mind, and in every single sector of every single class there's this persona, and then there's this, oh shit, something's wrong, badly wrong is going to happen very soon. And I think that's really been happening throughout 2017. And it's interesting how the media portrays all of these items as time goes on. Things eventually will manifest, and the stuff that's been deep seated in people that have been thinking about for a long time, realizing that mass migration isn't necessarily all that great. It's been really favouring the big corporations to lower the wages, but it really hasn't been this rosy sort of expansion of all these wealth of cultures to create this great production system. It hasn't necessarily worked in that way. And when the division opens up with an act of terrorism or with an attack on people, and division is displayed, then I think then things are starting to materialize. And I always think there's one thing that I always find quite funny is that it's not funny, but you look at it and you kind of laugh at what is happening in the media. You'll get this message that comes out and on Twitter about a terrorism attack has happened, and then people will it might even come from the police, and then or it might come from the government, and then all these people will start popping up and saying this is what's happened, this is your fault, and you see things are starting to manifest. We get the 1984 everything's okay kind of government telling you that everything's going to be good, tomorrow is going to be better than the previous day, but then deep seated you can see it in social media, and it's being trying to be quelled down as well. I'm sure there's plenty of algorithms and AI that's trying to suppress a lot of this information, but that's the kind of year that I've been seeing a lot through 2017.
Yeah, I've noticed the same phenomenon myself. This disconnect that you had mentioned between the news and the establishment, and then the reality of the situation. So, the media, it's interesting when one analyzes that in particular, because on the one hand, they benefit from sensational stories. So terror attacks, those are headlines, and that grabs people's attention, and that's good for them. But on the other hand, there's the issue that the media it's a capitalist institution itself, and they're beholden to advertisers. So what they report on and how they report it cannot be at odds with the fundamental imperatives of capital accumulation. So that brings to bear on the immigration question. That has a lot to do with what people call the liberal bias in the media in the United States. But the conservative media is not much different when it comes down to it. It's really just a matter of how they emphasize certain stories. But at the end of the day, they both toe the same line.
Now, in Marxism, is there a point, I'm sure there is something mentioned about corporations beginning to eat themselves?
Yeah, the joint stock company was rather new when Karl Marx was writing. He was one of the great analysts of how capital would be evolving over time. So when he was writing, he saw two phenomena emerge. Earlier in his life, capitalism was characterized by, single ownership or maybe partnerships in capitalist firms. So you would have a conventional capitalist owner who would also sort of manage the operations of the firm, and then that was it. Yeah. Issuing stocks for companies was just emerging when he wrote Capital, and he also noticed the emergence of worker cooperatives, where workers were the owners of their factories. So he saw capital evolving in two separate, mutually exclusive directions. Obviously, his sympathies were with the workers' control, but with the joint stock company, he had anticipated that the contradictions of capital that he analyzed just for typical commodity production were going to take on new forms with the capitalist corporation that was emerging. And that a lot of that has to do with the time horizon and investments. Yeah. Corporations since there's a division between management and ownership, they're more short-sighted than traditional capitalist enterprises, where an owner, he's thinking in longer terms. He's not thinking of the quarterly return and how that's going to look for shareholders. He's thinking of the long-term viability of his enterprise.
Yeah.
So that's one of the distinctions that's to be made. On the other hand, corporations and the economies of scale that they sort of induce, that also had implications for economic planning, which Marx was obviously very interested in.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, there was a lot that corporations brought into Marxist analysis.
Yeah, so because for 2017, I do see that corporations are really eating themselves from within. So, like a couple of ideas, a couple of examples is just movies. So a lot of the movies are just repetitive ideas which try to just suck into nostalgia, which is just it's a very empty thing. It's just emptiness, really. Whereas really what people are looking for are ideas, stories, things that can raise the sort of enlightenment of people. But that is just not happening. It's just like you're feeding yourself a diet which gives you no nutrition whatsoever. And the movie industry is dying in a very awful way, really. And but they're doing it on a financial level as well. I mentioned just before about they're buying their stock buybacks. So they leverage up, they give more to their shareholders just to pump up the value of the shares, and then just putting that debt away on the balance sheets. That's eventually going to manifest itself when you have interest rates rising. And then the seeds of the corporation, the political correctness that happens in terms of trying to put in all of these policies and regulations. A lot of these policies and regulations enable them to be very gigantic, monolithic enterprises that stops any kind of competition entering into the fray. And people were seeing, obviously, political correctness is dying. Like, if anybody tried, like, I don't know, if you're in this pub now, and it would be a very confrontational thing if you were trying to shut somebody up because they people were being outspoken now. I think, like, people don't want to be what's the point I'm trying to get to now? People are getting a little bit irritated by political correctness about she shouldn't say that will hurt that person's feelings. It is a very manipulative tool that is used, and really it prevents truth from coming out in a lot of ways. So I don't necessarily think that this political correctness is a corporate invention. It definitely is part of a government invention as well. But the corporation and the state do sit side by side in a lot of ways. They're a symbiotic relationship. But this, in turn, is a system. Well, the system that is generating itself. I don't necessarily say it's a profit generation driven thing. You might disagree, but there's something happening in 2017 where a lot of these things in the corporate world are really starting to go into overdrive, and I can see big shake-ups happening through into 2018 because of this.
Yeah, I agree. Couple things. When it comes to the genealogy of political correctness, that's a real complicated subject. It's really hard to pin down where this originated, but as a Marxist, I'm less concerned with who really came up with the idea as opposed to why it's being implemented now. It has to have some utility in terms of what the elite feel. Otherwise, it wouldn't be as ubiquitous as it's become. So, political correctness, the way I conceive of it is as an ideological device that the liberal bourgeoisie came up with, or if they didn't originate it, they utilize it as a sort of management technique, a social management technique. And that has a lot to do with the labor market. So on the one hand, we have a global marketplace and we have free movement of labor, more or less, and we have divergent and radically different populations commingling with one another, competing for jobs, et cetera, et cetera. That's a potentially incendiary environment because when it comes to the labor market, it's a zero-sum game.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, if you're an outspoken person in a workforce, then sorry, you're going to have to go. It's that kind
right,
of thing, isn't it? Yeah.
Exactly. That's potentially explosive, and that can lead to repercussions that corporations and capitalists in general would rather avoid.
And because we're in
So it would
because we're in the working environment of you haven't really got another job to go straight into, nobody can afford to be that outspoken person anymore. So they have to confined with this management practice of conforming to the ideals of the corporation or the state.
exactly. So as a worker, you're already expected to comply to a wide array of regulations in terms of how you dress, when you take your break, the work you do. Every facet of your working day is already managed. So when you introduce a whole new element, which is regulating your speech with coworkers and management, that's pushing this sort of paternalistic methodology to its limits, and it's pissing off a lot of people. Another facet of it, however, is ideological in the sense that you and I have talked in the past about the ideology of meritocracy and legitimizing capitalism per se, the class hierarchy. So political correctness is supposed to help in terms of preventing people from discriminating against one another, which would cause distortions in the class hierarchy. So if you could, for the sake of argument, eliminate racism, sexism, homophobia, what have you, from influencing who gets promoted, who makes their way to the top, that'll leave people with the impression that the class hierarchy is procedurally just, and therefore capitalism itself is itself a just institution. Of course, that's a non sequitur, but that's what the ideology would want people to believe. So that's why you see a lot of celebration of female CEOs, minority CEOs. It's trying to emphasize that we've made it to a point where discrimination just isn't happening, or we're transcending it, and we have this just meritocracy. Therefore, capitalism is beyond reproach by this ideology, if one were to subscribe to it.
Yeah, and it like we're trying to dissect this beast here of this entire chain and network of corporation, governments, media, political systems. This sort of incorporates all the sex scandals which are happening as well, in terms of like the Weinstein scandal. You've got this part of this monster which is eating itself from within, and you're seeing the things start to fall apart in different areas now. So you're seeing all these sex scandals which are coming out, and it's not just Hollywood, it's the government as well. So that's all starting to drop. It's all starting to come apart and unravel at the seams with this breakdown. And it's very interesting how I think obviously a lot of all of this is to do with money, but the system obviously is dying on the amount of debt that it's got. So there's less money to go around. There's less capability to bribe people, and this unraveling which is happening now in all of these little sectors, you're actually seeing all the fraudery which has been happening in the system come out. And one of the best ways of oppression is the way of trying to abuse your powers, abuse your privileges and everything. So it's interesting how all of these, and I don't think these sex scandals are even the tip of the iceberg. Really, you're going to see a lot more of this play out over time. It's like even like in financial fraud, we're not even sure of what is happening in play right now. But I'm rest assured there will be something in play that will come out that's even bigger than the Madoff scandal beforehand. So 2017 is the start of scandals, but I'd see this progressing in the future.
Yeah, I could see that happening. An escalation of the scandals. When it comes to Hollywood and the political establishment, why it's all coming out right now. I mean, all of us, I mean, those of us who aren't naive assume that this sort of behavior was happening anyway. Um, Whenever you have um, men and women with disparate power, um, then it's just an atmosphere that's rife for the potential of abuse. Especially in Hollywood, where it's such a niche labor market that um, if you're a if you're an executive at a film company, then you're you know actresses and actors are really in a tough predicament if they want to if they want to work with your studios. And there's they could it's not even just a matter of talent. There's so many talented people in this country that could you're just easily replaceable in the end. So unless you're willing to subject yourself to that kind of degradation, then they'll just find someone who is.
Well, just answer yourself. How many people do you know who are bad at telling lies? Not many people. So,
Right.
in that terms, a lot of people are fairly good actors. So
Right.
it's a market.
Very
It's a market that like pretty much most people could do. So it becomes obviously it becomes a thing about getting the most beautiful person and all those kind of things for the camera. But there is
Sure.
that area of like, oh, why was that actor picked? There's no reason for that
Mhm.
person to become that established. But there is all of this underground, backhanded awkwardness that happens behind the scenes, and obviously it happens in any power hierarchical system.
Right, exactly. And in terms of why it's all coming to light now, is part of it, I think, is just as banal as the bandwagon effect, where the story is so sensational, like the Harvey Weinstein story, for instance. And there's so many high profile people involved that it gets readers' attention and it gets ratings on the televised news. And then, that's a hot story. So they're going to try to replicate that. And they're going to look for abuse and scandals wherever they feel it's going to garner the most attention. And naturally, that's going to be with politicians and in the media in some sense. And not the news media, but in movies, television. I mean, they're not really highlighting this sort of behavior on a day-to-day level with, unknown people. You don't read about that in the local newspaper that much, even though it's happening. It's really celebrities and high-profile people where you're really getting the most of this kind of story.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't know where exactly you stand on all things of who really is in power, but my impression is that the ones who are really in power are the ones who have got the choice of life and death on people and haven't had to take any responsibility for their actions, and that's always going to be the intelligence agencies. They have got the ultimate power, and they don't really come under that much scrutiny and accountability. So I think there is factions within there, competing factions amongst all. How many agencies have you got? Secret agencies in America? So many, it's unbelievable. But I think they're pretty much at the apex, or they're very close to the apex of where power is and control is. And maybe presidents have a certain amount of power, but maybe bankers have a certain amount of power, but that's where I sort of position where the power lies. But as they start to unravel, because they don't necessarily have the amount of money to print into exponential like regions anymore. Beforehand, the US dollar was a fairly solid currency, but now we're seeing that maybe the US dollar isn't so solid as before. Then they don't even have the capacity to start bribing people off and paying people to get rid of people. So that is the way I see. There's that pyramid sort of thing, and I think that's how it's transpired. I mean, do you follow my kind of gear of thinking in terms of where power lies because of that position of the choice they can make choices to kill people but don't take responsibility?
I see where you're coming from in it, for sure. As a Marxist, I always believe that power ultimately resides in capital and those who wield it. So
if they got the power of, I don't know, creating bank accounts out of nowhere, then there's no there's a lot of power there.
Yeah, I mean, the way I conceptualize the state is as Marx and Engels did, where it's the executive committee of the ruling class. So when it comes to the power to take life with impunity, that's definitely going to reside in the intelligence agencies, and there's no shortage of those in the United States. But I don't think that they're autonomous forces. So, for instance, they're beholden on revenue gathered by taxes. They're also the health of the state is contingent upon the health of the economy itself.
Right.
So ultimately, they're all beholden to how capital is doing. Now, those agencies may, direct themselves in a certain sense, but if you look at them historically and what kind of agendas they're pushing forward, all of them ultimately just so happen to coincide with the interests of capital in some sense. Whether it's assassinating left-wing leaders in foreign countries that are a threat to corporate outlets for capital accumulation, or what have you, our foreign policy itself, all of it is geared towards what's in the best interest of global capital, and America in particular, our specific segment of the bourgeoisie. So yeah, they do have the ultimate power in terms of being immune from any consequences for their behavior, but their directives are coming from a different source, and I would say that's the imperatives of capital accumulation. Now, within the capitalist class itself, there's competing factions and divisions and what have you, but it has to do with whoever is hegemonic within the class at that given period.
Sure. And so while we're on that subject, do you think 2017 is very relative when it comes to our privacy and surveillance? Do you think that has got worse and has been a big factor for the year?
I think it's been getting worse for decades now. I think that, and that trajectory hasn't changed at all. In China, they have an expression for it, and China is probably one of the purest expressions of a capitalist dictatorship in the world today. And they call it social management. And I used that term earlier when I was discussing political correctness and bourgeois liberalism. The surveillance state, our civil rights, all of those are being progressively eroded, and I do see that general trend getting worse, because as the system itself continues to deteriorate and destabilize, the ruling class is going to be looking for ways to control what people do and say. And the only way they can do that is through the surveillance state.
Yeah.
And the reason they want to keep a close eye on what people are saying is because they're paranoid and scared because things are getting worse.
Yeah. And I see that. I think that there's obviously multi-tier connections which are going between Facebook and Google, and your mobile devices have got, for some reason, your mobile device has got a very good microphone in there which can listen to you wherever you are in the room. Applications, whenever you open a new app on your phone, it'll obviously have 1,000 different terms, and it'll say that it's going to switch on your camera, and there's no reason for it to switch on your camera. So there's all these devices now which are that can tap into you and listen to you and watch you wherever you are now, and it's almost like there are no secrets in society anymore. However, there's these big powers that can still monitor you and listen to you. And I would even ask the question, why are there so many secrets in society? Why, obviously, there's military reasons not to show where your missile solo bases are, but in terms of why are these super massive agencies? Why are there so many secrets in society? Why are people getting killed without the public knowledge? That maybe this is something that's going to materialize a little bit more into 2018. That where things are guiding now with this hyper surveillance, which we're sort of going along with. We get all these flashy advertisements for the new iPhone, and we think, oh, this is great. I can get this new iPhone, which is going to scan my face and know the 3D imagery. But this is, in some ways, this is more of our enslavement, because now now we're getting a full 3D model of your face. Now there's this slow progression of. This might sound like some kind of tinfoil hat wearing kind of person who thinks I'm being watched all the time, but I see it as an issue that needs to start coming into the open now. But it doesn't really manifest itself throughout 2017. It's just you get a couple of things about. I remember with Trump, and there was a story about I think it was with the FBI, and there was a murder case, and they needed to find a way to unlock the iPhone, and the iPhone. People from Apple didn't want to give the way capability to unlock the phone to get information. But I've got a feeling that there are ways to tap into that in any kind of computer code anyway. There's a method to hack into it anyway. But this thing which is happening in our world, and surveillance and secrecy, is it's a narrative that I've been very interested in, but I think it's fairly hushed in a lot of ways.
It is, and it's honestly very disconcerting, given the fact that so few people are seemingly concerned about this. And I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist either, but personally, I think that all of the major corporations, including Apple, that are involved in this kind of technology, surely are working with the government in some sense. Now, to what end is a matter of debate, but in any event, it's really disturbing nonetheless. And this is part of why I'm a materialist in my sociological analysis. Like, we've had revelations from Edward Snowden and Julian Assange regarding just how monitored we are as a population. There's been plenty of whistleblowers. There's a lot of information out there that should be of concern to people. But as long as people are able to make ends meet, they're not going to make a fuss about this. And even though the fundamentals of the economy haven't recovered, and I just earlier contended that things are getting worse for a lot of working people, nonetheless, they're still able to make ends meet, and consequently, they're not going to be looking into these sort of things with much care.
I think there's people that are genuinely frightened about it. I think it takes a lot to just even speak out sometimes about, oh, okay, like maybe you can have a barbecue party and talk about these things, but speaking on a public forum about, I'm worried about secret agencies, you're thinking, oh my gosh, this agency's got the power to just knock me off tomorrow. I could be in a road traffic accident tomorrow, and nobody would know any wiser. That kind of stuff. So
Or
it's like the ultimate assassins that you try and talk about openly, and then it can be quite sort of a worrying subject. And even obviously the media has to sort of approach the subject very sort of take one step back and talk about it on an intellectual level, but they don't sharpen the spike and really go into secret agencies. They would never even imagine to go into any kind of detail about, well, what about people's privacy? What about all these amendments? What about all of these rights which are being encroached on? Nobody's got any, like, well, there are obviously outspoken people on the internet, but on a large sort of voice of the public, a politician, somebody, it's not there, is it?
no, it's not there. And there's also, again, this is part of my materialist analysis, but there's this assumption that the government ultimately is has the right intention. So a lot of people, if you were to broach them with this subject and say, hey, almost everything you say or write on the internet is monitored, a lot of them would reply, well, I have nothing to hide. And it's probably a good thing because there's terrorists in the world, and I'd like the government to have the means by which to monitor them. So there's a sort of tacit consent to all of this. And what's so ironic is that for years in this country, one of its major criticisms of the old Soviet bloc was that citizens, say in East Germany, for instance, were surveilled a lot.
Yep.
The Stasi is invoked, and all. And if you really examine the records that the Stasi had, it paled in comparison to the sort of data that the United States government has, and the sort of technology it has at its disposal to surveil the American populace. And yet, this sort of disconnect is so evident, and nobody really talks about it. And again, I think it has to do with this sort of tacit approval and consent that, well, the government has the right intentions. I have nothing to hide. I have nothing to worry about. So I don't care.
You got to give up a
That's
little bit of your freedom to have some freedom. That's what they'll say.
Sure, yeah, that's a common response.
So, we obviously you can't talk about 2017 without mentioning terrorism, and there's been. How would you think about this? Is terrorism on the rise, or is it about the same?
I mean, the terrorist attacks, I don't know if it's on the rise, but it's disconcerting nonetheless. I think that the casualty figures are getting pretty distressing. I mean, nothing has compared to the attacks on 9/11 hitherto. But there's a lot of soft targets. ISIS, their tactics are changing. It makes one fearful of being in public places.
Yeah.
It's definitely had an effect on how people go about their daily lives, for sure.
Yeah, definitely.
And yet,
yeah. So yeah, I mean, sorry, continue.
No, I was just going to say, and yet no one's really discussing what causes this in the first place and how we might address it. All we do is look at the symptoms, but never the causes.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester, where the bombers just blew up young girls and people there. It's just like absolute like sick stuff that just gets shown into our faces, and that kind of thing, which is happening on a regular level. Now, I don't think it's been happening quite so much towards the end of this year, but it has definitely been happening quite a lot at the start of the year, I noticed. And the 2017 seems to be the year about getting into that Don't worry about having the higher powered gun so much. You can just jump into a car and cause as much mayhem as possible. And you think to yourself, you're right in saying what you said about going to any kind of festival or large procession. Like you you think twice, particularly if you've got kids with you. Do I really want to be here? Do I really want to get caught up in all of this mess? Yep. Mass crowds of people. They like as soon as chaos happens, people will stampede the whole lot. So, and you got this other thing. Obviously, I know that you're a bit of a gun advocate as well. There's no capacity to even do anything. And you can't disarm somebody who's got a car. You can't shoot in there to get them. There's nothing you can do. There's a eerie sense of helplessness about 2017, and it is coming out in like you notice that thing that happens when a terrorism attack happens and people go, oh yeah, like we're with you, here's the flag and that kind of stuff, and then there's this revolt against it. What is the point of this social media, oh everything's going to be okay and that kind of stuff? There's this deep-seated problem with these terrorism attacks. There's people are screaming for action, and I can see obviously that this is the year of people screaming that there's nothing that's being done. Do something, somebody do something. And I can see 2018 is going to be the year of somebody getting the wind of this and exploiting it to their own ends. You're going to get maybe the Hitlers, or not necessarily like Hitler's. Obviously you got a whole package of different things, but you're going to get somebody that's going to really exploit it and say, we want action, we want these things happening, and there's going to be a very large movement with that person I can see, or a number of people that I can see.
Yeah, I see the same trajectory that you're detecting. I think the big story of 2017 in terms of terrorism is how terrorism itself, the nature of it and its character has changed. So in preceding years, sort of the old strategy was just having as big of a target as possible. Sometimes it could be symbolic, but now, as you said, it's what's so unique about what's happened is that it's not conventional anymore. It's not bombs. It's not even necessarily guns. It's using whatever instruments you can to take life and just, acting out in public, trying to take as many soft targets down as possible. That's sort of what ISIS has introduced to this whole phenomena. And it's really troubling. And I agree that there's going to be some kind of, because whenever there's a terror attack, you start noticing partisan lines emerging. So you have, on the one hand, these pseudo leftist liberal types that are trying to, trying to warn against Islamophobia and all of these other things related to identity. On the other hand, you have a populist right-wing response, which is saying, look, these people shouldn't be here in the first place. We need to seal our borders. We need to deport people that are potential recruits for this kind of behavior. And, we saw in France, for instance, the Front National, they did really well in the last election. In Germany, you're noticing more of this. Donald Trump himself was a response to this in a way. So I agree that it's just a matter of time before some political movement takes advantage of the sentiments, the popular sentiments against this sort of behavior, and runs with it.
Yeah, there's only so much time that this stuff can be oppressed. I think there's too much, you can hear it straight away. Something must be done. Something must be done. And do you think that's a true response? Do you think something really should be done?
Well, I certainly think something should be done about this. I think that a lot can be done to sort of extinguish the sources of this behavior. As a leftist, my views are not typically shared by a lot of those who share my economic sympathies. But I think that they're deviating from classical Marxism in a lot of ways. But personally, I think that the way that you would address this, first of all, is by fundamentally changing our foreign policy. That's number one.
Yeah.
And number two, limiting the number of people whom you permit to immigrate to this country from those sources of terror activity. So when it comes to, say, the migrant and refugee issue, I'm sympathetic to women and children temporarily staying in a country while things subside in their own country, if it's a hotbed of terror or some kind of a war activity, temporarily. What I don't approve of is young men that are able-bodied, that could clearly stand a chance and stand and fight in their own countries, coming into Western nations. And that this has a lot to do with economic migration, and there's fallout as a consequence. There's once they get into these countries, they get alienated, things aren't as well as they thought they could be, and then they become potential recruits for this kind of radicalism.
So what do you think about this scenario? Because a definite right winger would say, look, I'm trying to work here, I'm trying to raise a family, and it's hard and it's tough, and then you get in all of these immigrants that have come from thousands of miles away into this country. They can use the welfare system. I've paid into it, my parents have paid into it for my lifetimes, so why should these people be getting all of this kind of this reward? My family, my generations have built into this, and this is turning into nothing. Is there sympathy from the left in that sense?
I mean, there's sympathy from me and from other small segments of the left, but from the campus left, or from the larger organizations, probably not so much. But that's why the left has not made any traction in these years. They're alienating ordinary people by taking irrational stances on all of this.
Yeah.
That hypothetical scenario that you just brought up, that's entirely true. That if you're a working person, you have a family, you're struggling to get by, and then all of a sudden now you're having to contend with Islamic terrorism and with migrants that are becoming a threat to your job. What does the left have to say to them? Well, I would say that action needs to be taken against that. But all of these other left-wing organizations, where their sympathies are in these humanitarian abstractions and have no practical consequence for working people, it pisses them off, and understandably so.
Yeah. Do you now, thinking ahead, because we obviously talked about a lot of these points in which somebody who's protectionist can be quite left-wing orientated. You can have somebody who's thinking about the workers, would try to limit immigration so you can raise the wages. Do you see that there could be some kind of putting down arms amongst the two ends of the spectrum of the political class to just unite in a way against a lot of these issues? Or do you think that's always going to be a tension point between both sides, trying to kind of raise the standards for both sides, pretty much the same people, but trying to attack it from the same, like, two different ends? Do you think that there ever could be, like what we're doing here, a lot of the conversations that we have, we kind of find majority of the points we're agreeing on, even though we're kind of from different political spectrums? Do you see that potentially could happen over time with the amount of information and knowledge that's out there, that there are things like, which I'll try and go into a little bit future, where money can be used for money can be transferred into a lot more things than just this debt system? It can be turned into conditions, it can be turned into providing goods. So do you see that this probably isn't really going to be something in 2018, it may be a decade in the future, but do you see that there could be certain fusions which happen across the political spectrum, or do you think it's going to just be polars?
Tactical alliances can always be made on specific issues. I think there are some unbridgeable gaps, as it were, separating, say, communists from capitalists. But when it comes to certain issues, there's always the potential to align with one another towards certain ends. I would never be opposed to such strategies myself. Um, but the way that the contemporary left is, they're so rigid in their platitudes and their commitments that they're incapable of really acting on good faith in such alliances. And the same concerns the right, for that matter. A lot
Yeah.
of right wing people would be unwilling to work with anyone that disagreed with their conception of property rights, for instance. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's exceedingly difficult to enter into those sort of alliances.
Yeah.
But I think that we'll probably see a little bit of both. You'll see some groups from divergent positions aligning with one another on certain issues, and then you'll see partisanship in other respects. So it
Yeah.
depends.
Because it's really strange. There is this indoctrinated class, isn't there? I think it. And I think this is another thing that we'll go into as well, is the generations. Now, I think we're classed as millennials, so I think we're like from like the 80s to the early 90s kind of thing. So we've still got a little bit of a fairly reasoned mind. We haven't been quite been brought up in the age of internet where everything's instant gratification. We had to work a little bit to get to some means, but there's a very big indoctrinated class. You will be the first one to sort of have a poke at a class of the left which likes to I don't know, celebrate political correctness and mass migration and things like that, which you don't think really even sits in the spectrum of Marxism. Whereas there is that generation, these generation differences, and we like to call them like the baby boomers and everything like that. So that's been a big thing in 2017. And do you see that getting bigger, and do you see that there's going to be more divisions about, oh, so why did the baby boomers have it so easy? Why could they just afford to have all these holidays and afford a house, and now they can use that house to have a luxurious lifestyle and retire, and I've just got nothing other than university degrees and debt, so and this university degree doesn't really even get me anywhere. So like, do you see that that's going to be that is the thing of 2017, or do you think that's going to get worse?
There is, to be sure, very sharp generational divides in a number of metrics, and I think that millennials are already coming to terms with this. That why were things better for my parents than for me, and that typically leads them to start analyzing the differences in how the economy was structured. And that can have great consequences for garnering sympathies for alternatives to the status quo. And millennials, from a lot of the polling that's been done, already show that they don't have the same psychological hangups about radical terms like socialism or communism or what have you. They're more willing to research and give those sort of ideas a fair hearing than their parents were, who grew up during the Cold War and during a time when capitalism actually was working for the middle class, those sort of things. So the generational divide is definitely of consequence. And where that's going to lead is anyone's guess. I'm particularly interested in the younger generations, even before millennials, because they've grown up in the internet age, and I'm curious how that's going to play out. But millennials, a lot of people, I feel that they've been unfairly treated, and they're blamed for so many things that we had nothing to do with.
Yeah.
We're sort of
We're trying to pick up.
victims of.
Yeah. We're trying to pick up all the pieces that the baby boomers they could issue all the bonds, and the bonds is just debt for the future, and now we've got to pick up all this debt and try and piece our way into this life. But this is all coming to an end, and I don't know. You could see in some ways that the millennials are an interesting. Like, well, obviously, we're taking the reins of power in this world now. It's our generation that are now going into the political spectrum. Our generation, which are the entrepreneurs and everything else. So it's interesting how this generation is going to work its way through the next, I don't know, 20, 30 years. And how, I don't know, I don't even think the baby boomers are going to have it that easy anymore, really. I mean, they've got some fantastically inflated assets, but I don't necessarily think they're really high on cash flow by any means.
No, they're not. One of the things I do get concerned with when it comes to generational politics is what I don't want to see happen is some sort of conflict between, say, millennials and baby boomers, where it turns into this zero-sum game of resentment where, younger people are voting against older people's interests and vice versa, say with Social Security or those sort of old age benefits. A lot of right wingers cynically exploit generational divides to try to abolish programs that they've always detested. So there's this sort of politics is rife with exploitation, and I am concerned with that. I wouldn't like to see that happen, but it's a possible outcome, though. It really depends which ideas start gaining traction.
Yeah, but as we say, like, obviously the one that is most definitely going to be exploited is something that must be done about terrorism. But I can see this one be exploited as well. This year, this generation thing has been materializing. I think the next, I can't even remember what the generation things are called. Maybe Generation X's are the ones after the millennials, but I could be wrong there. But it's the youngest generation. I think they get like pretty much, I don't know, they're like almost the forgotten generation. Nobody really cares about them. They're no hopers. They've just had it all easy. They've had all this instant gratification. It's a very sorry start of affair. Like, they've been raised on is not by their parents, because their parents had to work all the time, or they're single parents, and they've had to be raised on a pad. And it's a very sad state of affairs for them. And you really do worry about that. But I do, in some ways, think that the millennials can really be this essence of change. It's always you've heard about like that philosophical sort of argument where you you go up I can't remember the thing about going up the ladder in some shoes, and you go down the slide in you go up the ladder down the slide in slippers or something like that, where basically over time you have it so good that it basically unravels yourself. But I see that the millennials not really having it that good really ever. They've had rich parents, but they haven't really had a good bite of the cherry. They haven't really been able to have a good job. They've had a very hard competitive working environment pretty much all their lives. They haven't really had a chance to sort of get onto anything that's really been a good investment strategy. Maybe you could say like Bitcoin's probably the start of something for them, but there hasn't really been their sort of boom period where they've sort of flourished in ideas. But I do see that hard grit and that hard times that they're only really starting on right now might be a good thing for this generation, and it may push out some promising things for the future.
Yeah, I think so too. I've always been optimistic about millennials in terms of paradigm shifts and transformative thinking, and I am genuinely interested to see what our generation is going to do with the circumstances that we've inherited. It can go in many directions. I'm hoping, obviously, for best case scenario for my political philosophy, but in any event, I think just the fact that our generation is we inherited circumstances that are compelling us to start thinking in new ways. That's encouraging in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and obviously, our generation are the ones that started to get given like the internet after our childhood. So it's interested in that respect. We've had a childhood where we've had to sort of think on our own, and then we provided with all this information, and this information has been obviously it's been a trigger for us in a lot of ways. Yeah, very very interesting there. Now, in terms of universities and that sort of that obviously they are the apex of knowledge. Now, we was talking about obviously the internet being of knowledge, but we've got the universities now. They've been in the media a lot of times, particularly backlashes against Milo and clashes, and you get Antifa coming down fighting the alt right. So all of these different it's becoming very strange universities. If I had a kid now who was of an age to go to university, I'll be like, gosh, do you really want to get yourself involved in a university? What is it really going to get? What is your value added you're going to get from this? I can see a lot of debt coming your way, but I can't really see much in the way of benefit. Do you see that the 2017 is the like the media? It's kind of like a falling point for universities, and their pinnacle point throughout history was this beacon of light of liberalism and a beacon for entrepreneurism and, well, not necessarily entrepreneurism, but just the Enlightenment. So I don't see that anymore from universities. I just see them as kind of an indoctrinating, kowtowing system of appeasement, and I don't see the benefits in society with the age that we have with the internet now, and people finding their own education. And I see that that system is again eating itself from within.
Yeah. In terms of the university system being a institution that imparts Enlightenment values, I think that the days of that are long gone right now. I think that what they've become essentially is vocational schools where and not in terms of job training, but in terms of a college degree yielding you a higher return in the labor market. That's why people are going, that's why they'll continue to go. But when it comes to the ideology that's coming out of universities, I think one of the big stories of 2017, and this is going to have ramifications for years to come, is that universities and the quote unquote progressive left, and by left I mean left wing of capital, not radical leftism, they've enabled the alt-right and conservatives to posture as champions of freedom of speech and a number of free association and a number of other Enlightenment principles that have traditionally been left-wing positions. The progenitors of speech censorship have always been on the reactionary right, and yet because the progressive left has adopted, I mean, progressivism from its outset in the progressive era in the 1920s has always been a paternalistic political philosophy.
Yeah.
It wasn't like Marxism and classical communism, which descended from the Enlightenment tradition, which champions free speech, free expression, free association. Progressivism was always illiberal. It was always a matter of having a technocratic elite determine what the right course of action is, what the proper speech is. And universities have just taken that philosophy and exacerbated it.
Yeah,
And
and
now they're permitting conservatives to posture as though they're these, you know, daring champions of enlightenment values. And that's one of the most detestable outcomes of 2017 in my estimation.
yeah. Who was the guy yeah, Isaac Newton. Like, you think about him, you think about the excellence that was created. Like, it was a lot of sort of him being a hermit, studying, getting this world of knowledge. You could say the same kind of thing, even though I don't think he necessarily went to a university. But Karl Marx, he obviously studied at London Library and everything else. But that sort of individual sort of gathering of information creates that like intellect and that spark of imagination that can invent things. You think of Leonardo da Vinci just can sit in a room like writing and coming up with plans of helicopters and things like that. That sprouting of those different enlightenment periods, which really ascend us. University is just a group thing now. It's like this group think mentality. It's a weird thing. It doesn't really sprout that ingenious push on a level just to think and push yourself hard and then to express and then maybe share your ideas. But it doesn't do that. It's really just I've talked about this before about how ideas now are almost suppressed. You have to sort of write to your university professor that something that he agrees with, and then if you wanted to put anything into, even in the scientific world, if you wanted to write a paper, you have to write something that appeases everybody else. These are all just big pillars of appeasement, aren't they?
They are. Really, what we're discussing is how universities now, as opposed to in the past when they would sort of spark ingenuity, innovative thinking, enlightenment, as we put it. Now, what they are is they're simply institutions where, as you said, groupthink is fostered. It's really this ossified, banal regimen where you're encouraged to not think against the grain, to just parrot what your professors say. In the humanities, that happens to be progressive paternalism, just parroting the right talking points. And then in the STEM majors, it's not paradigm shifting innovative thought. It's again just repeating what your professors told you. It's not an environment that's conducive to creativity in any sense of the term.
Yeah. So I think 2017 just shows that universities are they got these beautiful buildings everywhere and they're always advertising, but I think they're dying, and I can't see where this they're just too big. It's just a very strange thing that's been created, and it doesn't do its intended purpose. Obviously, we've talked about the intended purpose of that spark, but now they're just well, a lot of people are just hoping for that ticket at the end, that degree which they can present to their future employer. That's all that really, on a buyer level, that's all it's become. And to do that, you've got to just get yourself into a mountain load of debt. The whole university structure is all based upon mountings of debt, and they just want to gobble themselves from within. They want to get bigger and bigger and bigger and have everybody go to university. I don't even think everybody should be going to university. I think really just a few select people really should be going into university, and a lot of people can, majority of people can learn even fairly tricky jobs on hand, I think. And I think with just probably about no more than about 3 months training, most people could probably do about 98% of the jobs out there. I'm honestly on that kind of mind frame, and I really do not think you need all of these university degrees to get there.
No, you don't. In my opinion, universities started failing the moment they stopped imparting a classical education in their pupils. And then standards started to get lowered. But the utility of a university from a bourgeois perspective is that And this is why degrees still have purchase in the labor market, is that it proves to employers that you have the self-discipline to go to classes and do as you're told for 4 years or however amount of time it was. And that's enough for an employer to trust you and to give you a higher wage than he does somebody who didn't do that themselves. They didn't incur the debt, but they also it's riskier in terms of figuring out what kind of character that applicant has.
Yeah.
So that's the problem. They degrees have a utility to an employer purely for that alone, but the value of the degree itself, in my estimation, is useless because the sort of information you're getting in universities is worthless.
Yeah, it's all old stuff. Now, I think we're probably going to have to talk about cryptos, because
Yeah.
this obviously, the value of everything show where I've been speaking a lot about it myself. I've been trying to talk about how ideas can span from cryptocurrencies. Now, I see it from my side as that we're getting into a speculative level. Now, this has been existing from all the previous years. Everybody's, for some reason, it does trigger a lot of things in the media. From even its early years when it was only $1, it was hitting the media how Bitcoin is rising, but it's reaching that level now where the mainstream population are all talking about it now. It's reaching fever pitch. Now, I still don't think even maybe 2% of the West really even have dabbled in it or touched it or owned it. So I don't even think that many people are really involved in cryptocurrencies. But I do think that we are reaching those levels where people are looking into it, but probably a little bit more for the wrong means. They're looking at the bubble. They're thinking, oh, I might miss out on this. Everyone's getting rich and I'm missing out, so I better get involved. And the words of Ponzi schemes are being worded around as well. Now, I don't necessarily... I see this as a beginning phase, but yeah, I just want to get a bit of analysis on this.
I think that the big story recently was Bitcoin and the bubble that's surrounding that. Um, Irrespective of what the long-term utility of cryptocurrencies might be, at the current juncture, the actual use value of say Bitcoin is very limited in that only certain vendors accept it. A lot of countries recently, South Korea has just issued regulations against its use. And since it has a limited use value at the moment, all of the speculation that was surrounding it was inevitably going to lead to a bubble scenario occurring. So the second that I started seeing commercials on YouTube and people who I know discuss Bitcoin, people who had hitherto never expressed any interest in it at all, I started thinking, okay, this is a potential hazard. This is bubble making material. And that's precisely what happened. It got overvalued because everyone all of a sudden got interested in it, and they were misled by a lot of so-called finance experts into investing in Bitcoin. And really, and mind you, this isn't to denigrate the impressive technology, the blockchain technology associated with it. I think that is clearly something that's going to be of continued interest and use going forward.
Even for Marxists?
Even for a Marxist like me, I still find it fascinating. I think that its application is broader than a lot of people anticipate. So that's interesting. That's something that I'm following. But the speculative craze that surrounded Bitcoin in particular, that was unfortunate, and I see that having terrible repercussions in the months ahead. Now, I think what's needed is a correction. I think that the value of Bitcoin has to come down and reflect its current use value, which is considerably lower than what it's currently trading at. So that needs to happen. Whether or not it's going to be massively devalued in 2018, I don't know. There's a lot of opinions going in both directions. I happen to think that that's likely, because as people get interested in it and invest in it, they're going to start questioning its utility at the moment, and then they're going to come to the realization that, okay, maybe this isn't the best means of exchange at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in some ways, I see. Every industry, like especially media industry, always has to start with pornography. Do you know what I mean? Like with the VHSs
Mhm.
and stuff like that. I see Bitcoin as like the pornography point of cryptos. It's at the beginning stage. It's tantalizing. It's titillating to people just to see this wealth generation thing that's happening in front of everybody's eyes. But I want to ask you one question actually. What do you think in terms of money? Have you ever heard of the saying that money is the ultimate voting system?
Yeah, where people vote with their dollars, and
Yeah.
I mean, there's a grain of truth in that, sure.
Yeah, and so you kind of agree to a certain extent, but obviously you don't necessarily obviously agree about the debt-based system and central banking and all of these kind of facets that happen with it. But you do agree to an extent that there is a tendency of money as a methods of communication.
Yeah, it has an epistemological function for sure, especially in orientating production and exchange. Obviously, it possesses that function, and it's important for that reason.
Yeah,
But yeah, obviously, I'm not a proponent of debt fueled monetary policies or anything like that. As a Marxist, the sort of currency I envisage in the future is going to be based upon labor time and not fiat or gold or commodities.
right. Well, because I mean, obviously, this is probably one of the areas which we both kind of like. You have a point, and I try. I trying to peck at your sort of idea of money, and I'm trying to like really say that with cryptos, there's a potential here to have money that can do more things than just distribute value, and you be a measure to oppress people and get yourself to the top so that you can funnel down debt to the people and you can extract the wealth from the bottom and bring it to the top. I I think money obviously has displayed a lot of that over time, and I think you'll agree with me on that sense.
Yes.
But I do think that with what has happened with Bitcoin and what is going to begin to happen in 2018 is that we're gonna 2018 is going to be very capitalist kind of things which are going to be happening with cryptos. It's not the start of a lot of the political cryptos. A lot of some of them are happening, but not necessarily happening yet. You're going to get more capitalistic cryptos which are going to come out, which can remove the central man who's taking the margin. So, for example, banking, crypto banking, where you can find somebody to lend your money to directly. You can use a syndicate. There's going to be a lot of these kind of capitalistic cryptos which are going to really start to product launch and really flourish into the next 2018. There's going to be and that's obviously a lot of finance driven ones which are going to show that money in essence out of the hands of centralized systems is going to bring a lot more benefits. Would you agree in those terms? If you take money outside of the terms of central banking and governments and leave it a little bit more freer to people, do you think there's more benefits to society? I mean, not in on the balance of things.
Yeah, I think it has that potential. But I'm something of a dialectical thinker, so I always try to examine both sides of the argument.
Yeah,
So on the one hand, it does have a liberating quality where it's taking power out of the hands of the state apparatus or even financial institutions. Because depending on one's theory of money, I'm not sure how much modern monetary theory you're familiar with, but um, one of the arguments is that banks issue money. It's not a matter of fractional reserve banking. They just create money out of thin air
Correct.
and then issue it to people. So cryptocurrencies are an alternative to that. But then at the same time, they have been used and continue to be used for nefarious purposes. So for black market activities such as drug and sex, illicit activities on the internet. That's obviously a cause for concern. Money laundering, stuff like that. That troubles me, and I'm sure that advocates of cryptocurrencies have remedies for those sort of things. I'm not as well read in that literature, but I do know that they currently serve that function, and that does cause me some concern.
Yeah.
In terms of how I envision it, for my own political philosophy, I think that some of the technology surrounding it can have utility for decentralized economic planning. But again, the way that I foresee that transpiring is at odds with how cryptocurrencies are currently used as a means of exchange.
Yeah.
But that's a whole other subject for another day. But yeah, I mean,
yeah, I would like to just tap into that just one more. Like with your system, you do talk about either voting as a way of organization, or you talk about some kind of monetary system for the labor value that you provide.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. So these are methods of communication, right? These are just channels of communication, and I would say that there isn't too much of a dissimilar fact here, where I come in and say you can. And now, obviously, when I use the word money, obviously it has all these different terms, and it's got a pack. You instantly think of money, and you're probably thinking about bloody skeletons with bloody burning loads of fire in their hands and everything else. But when I'm talking about money, I'm talking about like a communication device of values, and your system can be used in a way whereby you're exchanging value in a money system to vote, to, okay, I want to pay into that coin because it is providing services to the local community. And that is a very leftist kind of ideology and stuff like that, but it's on a voluntarism kind of basis. There is a coin there that can start to be used to work in a farming sense as well. Now, I say that there's cryptos there. We're obviously at the very beginning stages of cryptos, and it's going to use the capitalist model for the meantime. It doesn't realize that it's a decentralized system, so there isn't necessarily this, obviously, capitalism which is being split out and going to all the people, and people are actually finding that without the middlemen they can actually gather more wealth for themselves. That's a great thing. But then they're going to find that cryptos can do more things. It's money with conditions, money with escrow support, money. You think about the world that we live in. If you want to do transactions and advanced, I don't know, banking and rolling inventories and things like that, you need solicitors, you need bankers, you need all these kind of things. Now, money is going to advance, and it's going to be a communication device beyond what we can comprehend right now, that can provide incredible services for people. And it can, and I will say a lot of these theories can fit inside the realms of your theories, I would say.
Yeah, I can see how that would follow from that premise. I think that when I think of currency and an exchange, money in particular. Marxists typically, we think of two things. We think of money as a medium of exchange, and then we think of money when it reaches a certain quantitative threshold, it has a qualitative transformation into capital. Capital meaning the ability for money to create more money by virtue of the circuit of capital accumulation. So you have a money, you produce a commodity with said money, and then you have more money at the end of the chain, and that entails wage, labor exploitation, hierarchy, et cetera, et cetera. We've been through that before. When it comes to cryptocurrencies, as I said, the technology that facilitates a lot of it can be of use to a decentralized planning process. In the sense of the algorithms that are employed.
Yeah.
Transitioning to, but my major thing is that once you attain a communist mode of production, you no longer are exchanging in the sense that you do in a market setting. Now, I'm not the sort of person that thinks that we can go straight from a capitalist market into a decentralized, planned communist society. I think there's going to be a intermediary phase where you're still going to have market exchange for a little while. And in that sense, I think that the cryptocurrency transformative qualities that you're referring to could be of utility there.
Yeah.
But once you get into a mode of production where economic activity is planned, however, then its utility becomes less apparent, in my opinion. But I see where you're coming from, sure.
Now, obviously, one of the criticisms of how a lot of communist societies have failed is because of the planned system has not been able to work on a market level to provide the goods which are scarce and things like that. And I just see, like, obviously, if you had multi-tiers of communication devices which were working, not necessarily even on a plan level where we all got to sit together and work out how much corn to harvest next year, but on a monetary level, just to say, right, I'm going to invest in this corn coin. It's a bad example I'm using here, but this is just an thing where multi-tiered communication which is going through in money transfers, which doesn't necessarily mean that there's oppression which is happening, but there is a form of communication and planned management in a society which doesn't have debt. I mean, you may even just say, okay, well, this might be just step one, but you can definitely see that there is. I say there's an emergence and a connection between the two of our spectrums in that sense.
Oh, certainly, I completely see that. I think that money serving its in terms of an epistemic function, that is clearly important when it comes to coordinating economic activity. One of the problems with traditional centrally planned state socialist economies was that, planners had an exceedingly difficult time figuring out the social opportunity costs of production. And in market economies, money serves that function. It can tell you what a better allocation of resources is just based off of the exchange taking place.
Yeah.
And that was one of the shortcomings of centralized planning. I think a lot of this is addressed in the decentralized planned model that I propose. But nevertheless, I do see the liberating potential of cryptocurrencies as you envisage that their application. It's just, I think it's going to be more time that we experiment and develop that sort of technology. So at their current level and their current use, it's very capitalistic and it's serving a purpose, to be sure, but its utility is limited and its future is uncertain. It really depends on how people further develop it. But I do see the thread that you're referring to, where it can serve social functions and help um, foster and facilitate socialistic aims.
Yeah. And when we talk about cryptos, and 2017 has been this boom in speculative and day trading and all that kind of stuff, that's just obviously a lot of people that are trying to make a quick buck and stuff like that. But there are people out there who are just seeing the technology, thinking to themselves, well, the economy's not in a very great shape. US dollar has been rehypothecated and expanded into oblivion. I would like to stay in something whereby there is a very secure accounting system whereby I know how much is allocated and it is incorruptible. Whereas on the other hand, you have this very unaccountable system which is going to collapse. And obviously, we mentioned just beforehand into leaning into 2018, and we're looking at the sex scandals and how this stuff is getting pressed down and pressed down until it's going to manifest again. Is the corruption is going to spill out, and it's going to spill out in the financial markets in a large way, and people at a certain point, and it will potentially happen next year, will think to themselves, I need to get myself into an asset or something which is incorruptible. Now, a lot of people might say, oh, I want to get into an asset like gold or silver, and there's merits in that as well, but people might want to get in land and things, and that's a very secure thing to get into as well. But on a transactional level and trying to live a daily life, I think still, as much as you may think that you're going to get to a saturation point where the bubble is going to reach a certain point, and because there's no more asset appreciation left there, it's going to crash again. You're still going to get a point in which people are going to go, I need to find security, and in this mathematical system where it cannot be corrupted because of timing and finding the correct blockchain and announcing that to the rest of the blockchain and independent verification, that is a system that's far more secure than what we have right now in place. And I think 2018 may be that year where a bigger transfer may even happen. And it might not necessarily be in Bitcoin. It could be in other altcoins as well, where the capitalistic things happen. But it could definitely be in Bitcoin. And I see Bitcoin. It's not that I'm saying to people just go out there and buy Bitcoin, but I can see Bitcoin still going up much further if problems happen in financial markets.
Yeah, to the extent that financial markets and the purchasing power of whether it's the US dollar, the euro, or any other major currency, to the extent that destabilizes in 2018, then the use value of alternative currencies is obviously going to be increase. It's sort of contingent upon what happens there. We haven't seen the hyperinflation that a lot of Austrians had predicted would ensue with, say, the U.S. dollar, and I don't see that on the horizon either. So whatever happens with the U.S. dollar in 2018, what I don't foresee is a hyperinflation. There's a lot of other things that can happen that will lead to Bitcoin or any other cryptocurrency becoming attractive to investors and to just day-to-day traders, but at the same time, I still think that Bitcoin in particular is massively overvalued, at least at the current juncture. I think that the speculative craze surrounding it just boosted the price beyond what its current utility warrants. So where the price goes in 2018, I'm not sure. Again, I think it is contingent upon what happens with fiat currencies worldwide. But one of the more concerning things is how governments are responding to it. And I had mentioned previously South Korea, for instance, really cracking down on cryptocurrencies. I think that that's going to start becoming evident in other countries also, and that can have major repercussions for its price.
Well, I think I've got this argument against that in a funny way, and I'll explain it. There's cryptos out there called Monero, and Monero, you have no accounting ledger where you know the transaction, who the transaction came from, where it came from, but you know that you have got that value and you possess that value. Now, there's ultimate secrecy and there's ultimate privacy, and there is a store of wealth there. Now, let's just say that you're a government official that has just been taking a lot of bribes and the whole system's about to collapse, and you want to get away. Where are you going to put your money?
Yeah, it's a good question. Traditionally, a lot of people put their money in, say, gold, for instance, because it has a store of value, it has commercial application. It's steady. It goes through highs and lows, but it always maintains some intrinsic value. So people have been doing that for a while. When it comes to cryptocurrencies, I think there's still a lot of uncertainty surrounding them.
Yeah.
Like they're relatively new to a lot of people, and as a consequence, I still think there's going to be some hesitation to use it as a hedge against issues in the financial market. And I was going to ask you also. I've read a few stories, nothing in depth, but a few stories about hackers, for instance, getting involved in Bitcoin and stealing coins or jeopardizing the software, the information. Are you familiar with this? What that means? What it entails?
Yeah, well, they can't really hack the blockchain itself because everyone's got their own copy of the chain, so they would literally have to be a 51% attack of the chain, and it's just too impossible. They would never have the computing power to overtake the entire system. But what they can do is, say, if you went to an exchange which stored bitcoins on there, which is basically like keys or codes, there's a honeypot there which they can get involved in and they can hack into. And once they've got those keys, if anybody gets your keys, the game's up for you. You've lost your coins. So any online places where there's keys that are left there, they're susceptible. But the actual chain, because it's broken up and independent, there's not a method of hacking the chain. It's all about these little honeypots. If you have your wallet online on an online business, and that if they're not they haven't got the correct practices and controls in place, then they're going to be hacked. Or if you leave your keys on an online web tool and things like that, that's where you're susceptible to hacking. It's if you ever get a wallet and you should really take it and put it into a paper key, or you should put it onto a hardware wallet, and then you're never susceptible to a hack. But it's all about the keys. Everyone wants to get access to the keys, but the actual blockchain itself, it's impossible. You would need to take over all the computing and all the different individual blockchains which have been created. It's all distributed. Everyone's got the same independent ledger, and you would have to overtake that. So that's impossible. But the keys is what people are after. But as long as you practice taking it offline and leaving it on a hardware wallet or on a paper wallet, you can't be hacked.
So in that sense, the keys are sort of analogous to, say, a merchant that has credit card or debit card information on their website that hackers can gain access to, something
Correct.
like that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So there's nothing uniquely vulnerable about it.
No, definitely not. And I mean, the whole reason, one of the main things about the white paper of Bitcoin is to create a trustless system whereby you do not require the middleman. And the middleman is a very costly thing, and that middleman is obviously a key from a Marxist side of oppression, I would say. If you hold the if you hold the gates to access to a certain market, or if you hold the keys or the gates to certain areas, then you have the ability to use that power to oppress the other person and charge that incredible margin, and you can just relax and enjoy a very luscious life without very, very minimal work, whereas the other person has to graft very hard to get by. So, yeah, one of the interesting things I heard recently is that there's probably, obviously, I don't think there's many great intellectual leftists who are out there anyway, but you're the only one who I can actually talk to and who's willing to listen to this kind of stuff. But I really think that the left should be massively jumping on stuff like this, like in a massive way. But I don't know why. I don't know why the left doesn't seem to do that as much. It seems to be the cryptos are in the hands of the capitalists.
Yeah, I mean, part of the problem is what I always harken back to, which is the fact that a lot of people who identify as left wing today are just progressive technocrats that are obsessed with identity politics and irrelevant. If they're not really interested in the hard-nosed economic problems facing working people.
Yeah.
They're distracted with all kinds of other stuff. And then the communists that are interested in economics, they focus on arcane dilemmas from the past, so planning issues that face the Soviet economy, or how exchange was organized in anarchist Spain, or things like that, which are interesting, things that I've always studied, but they're so enamored and fixated on that they're not really looking at modern day trends and new technologies.
Because obviously, like Karl Marx never really wrote the book of how to do it, did he? So it was always an open book. That he didn't realize that if you provided him with that information of like, hey, there's a system to independently exchange value without having a banking system. What do you think that? Add that to your thoughts, Karl Marx. What do you think that could potentially mean? What about an internet and a system where everybody can communicate to each other instantly? What do you think about that, Karl Marx? It really would be good to get some advanced thinker on these areas from the left, just to say, whoa, if Marx did have that information, where would he take that?
Right. I'm honestly the one Marxist social scientist that I can think of who has engaged with this literature at all is the Marxist economist David Harvey. He's worth looking into for our listeners. I disagree with a lot of his analysis on the economic crisis, for instance, and his approach to value theory, but he's still a really engaging thinker, very innovative. He keeps track of current trends, and he has written on alternative currencies, not so much cryptocurrencies, although he has touched on it. He's one of the few. So he's worth checking into. Also, Michael Roberts has written on it a bit.
Incidentally,
so there's a couple of features.
Is he against cryptos, I imagine?
No, David Harvey is more he's more optimistic about their potential uses. Okay. He's agnostic as to how they're going to develop, but he's willing to engage with the literature and the ideas. He's not dismissive of them. A lot of leftist economists are dismissive of cryptocurrencies, at least as they're currently constituted. So off the top of my head, I can think of Yanis Varoufakis, Richard Wolff, people, and mind you, there are very divergent viewpoints. Whenever you say Marxist, it's a broad tent, to put it mildly. So these guys are coming from many different perspectives, and their points of emphasis and their analysis diverge in radical ways. But yeah, by and large, I think the consensus amongst genuine leftist economists is towards the negative when it comes to cryptocurrencies. But there are a few that are agnostic. I consider myself agnostic, but interested in them. And there are a few of us out there, and there should be more, as you
Yeah.
said. I
Yeah.
think that it's something that we need to start analyzing.
Yeah. And I see this like this stuff cannot be held down. This is even if there was a big left movement of central planning, there's no way to suppress cryptos or blockchain. There's no way that even a right wing authoritarian political system came to power. There's no way to stop the decentralizing ability of cryptos. So, I mean, what we're doing here, and we're discussing our political views and how they potentially could synergize and how it could span out in the future. I can see this is all going to get, I talked about it earlier, but it's going to get a lot more relevant in the future. And we're just seeing the beginning stages of, that guy stole a lot of money from me in the past, and now I can actually live a life which is kind of comfortable or a bit better. But gradually we're going to say, why did we ever have this government system which was so rubbish at providing services to me when I can do this and do that with this crypto? And it's going to become more relevant. I'm surprised that I haven't even found any show that even talks about half the stuff that we discuss on this. Maybe there are some out there, but they're very niche, and they've only got like a couple of hundred followers. But it's I see this is going to materialize. I think the subjects we talk about are probably going to start to really come into fruition in the late 20s. But right now it's still, we're waiting for that crash, and that crash it's like the spring that's getting loaded and pushed down even harder, and that's most of 2017, and we're starting to see a lot of the outspills of scandals, debt that's really should start to unwind, and you're seeing little people, seeing people talk about problems of how much debt they're under, and it's going to spill out at some point. And how this new technology interacts with the problems in finance is going to be very relevant to us in our futures, I find. And just to say that Bitcoin is this speculative bubble, it's going to be the new tulip mania, and then that's going to be it, put a full stop, and that's the end of that chapter, I definitely would say no. That is something that's going to be with us for the rest of our lives, and it's going to be going way into the future.
Yeah, and with respect to Bitcoin in particular, I would say that regardless of what happens to Bitcoin per se, cryptocurrencies and the blockchain technology, that isn't going to go anywhere. So it's conceivable that Bitcoin can fall by the wayside one day, but there's so many other cryptocurrencies that use the same methodology that, and the utility is manifest as you've already described, that it's not going anywhere. The cryptocurrencies aren't going to all of a sudden vanish overnight, even if Bitcoin should have a fall from grace. So that much is absolutely true. And in terms of 2018, since you and I have been engaged in dialogue, I've been forecasting the coming crisis or continuation of the crisis for a long time. But what I can say about what's transpired in 2017 is that none of the metrics that I analyze for the health of an economy have improved, really. All that's happened is better window dressing and the locus of the problem being kicked around here and there. All of the troubling signs persist, and I think I don't know if 2018 is going to spell the final demise of the system or anything to that effect. But at the very least, I don't see things improving short of mass capital devaluation, which is not politically feasible. So it should be interesting to see how that plays out in the coming year.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's. That's my take.
Yeah, I think I just want to cover, obviously, we can't cover a year without talking about the other nations in the world. And I kind of, it's kind of just like nuisance news in a way, but there's things about the, you got Russia scandals. There's a lot of like Russia meddling in hacking. Then you've got North Korea. You've got China, slight China tensions. Maybe that's been a relevant thing, and we're not sure what's going to happen with North Korea next year. Maybe China needs to do something about it. Maybe America will do something about it. There's those things which are on the boil. Do you think that they're just going to fizzle out, or do you think just something? China's like with the North Korea situation. China hasn't. They're not a big like axe wielding, throwing around nation too much, are they? I mean, obviously they're trying to build up their military on the quiet, but remember the mentality of Chinese are very sort of patient players. When you think about the games that they play Go, and they spend their time and studying and strategy and stuff like that. And they don't necessarily want to just start throwing up things in the air. They've been doing fairly well over this time. They don't want to create a big political mess and all the nations attacking them and stuff like that. That they want to play a very diplomatic thing, whereas America is a lot more sort of gun ho in a lot of senses. So I mean, my view is that probably with North Korea, China probably will have to do something on the quiet to maybe, I don't know, change the leaders or trying to get a system that they want in place, because I'm sure they don't want America on their doorstep. So it will have, the impetus will have to come from China, and obviously China's just China is really China's choice whether America gets involved or not. And I don't think China really wants America to get involved. So I think China will be the player that must do something about North Korea next year. I don't know where you stand on this.
Right. I think that Chinese culture produces tactical thinkers, as you said. And historically, China has not been keen on getting involved in aggressive foreign policy. That's not their historical stratagem, and that's not something that the Chinese Communist Party, and I use communists in scare quotes when I say it, that I I don't think that's something they're interested in. I think they want to continue to develop their forces of production in relative peace. They do have imperial ambitions when it comes to their foreign economic strategy, especially with respect to Africa and extracting raw materials to fuel their production. But that's a separate matter. When it comes to North Korea, the saber rattling out of the Trump administration is very distressing, especially given the fact that it's a nuclear power. And that should cause alarm to South Korea, Japan, and other neighboring states, because the last thing you'd want to do is provoke a fight with a military apparatus of that caliber. The United States is in no position to be issuing threats to a country like that. Like we've been involved in the Middle Eastern war, if you want to call it that, for well over a decade, and we've made such abysmal progress towards that end that the notion that we could even gesture at a war with Korea is absurd, with North Korea. But nonetheless, part of me thinks that Trump's rhetoric against the regime in North Korea, I think that's just so much shit to distract people.
Yeah.
I don't think that the military are hawkish military. I don't think the commanders really think that's a feasible option for us.
Do you think China will have to play the first move? Maybe they have to do a false flag and then they have to do the move? Because I can't see that Trump will ever get the permission to go in there. China would be like, under no circumstances are you going to invade a country just below us. So I can see them making the move to do it. They probably don't want to do it, but they know they have to do it, kind of thing.
Sure. To the extent that China cares at all about how North Korea is managed, they've been quietly be having negotiations and talks with North Korea for a long time. What they would like ideally is for North Korea to become analogous to China in its political and economic role, where you have an authoritarian state apparatus presiding over a capitalist market economy. That's what they would like. And pretty much that's what North Korea has been steadily moving towards. A lot of people don't realize that. It's not this Soviet style state socialist economy anymore. Like they've introduced a lot of market elements in their economy. I think China is somewhat concerned about the political regime there to the insofar as they want to make sure that there's not someone in power that's going to play fast and loose with nuclear weapons. But I honestly don't think that Kim Jong Un is of that character. Like for all his faults, I don't see him doing something that irrational unless we provoke him towards that end. A lot of what he's done has been out of response to what the Trump administration has been directing his way. So I think that the Chinese government is going to probably, before they even converse with North Korea, they're going to try to get the United States to tone down on some of the rhetoric that it's targeting at North Korea. I mean, prior to Trump's administration, there hadn't been any concern about nuclear arms in North Korea. Everyone knew that they were developing them. Everybody knew that that was inevitable. They probably have had those developed for years now. But all of a sudden, it's this major news item when in reality, I mean, that's just insurance for any regime.
Yeah.
What a lot of despots have learned from the Middle Eastern wars we've been engaged in is that the one way to ensure political stability is to develop nuclear weapons. Look what happened to Gaddafi. He didn't have that, and he met a really gruesome end. And any dictator that's interested in his own well-being is going to take the cue that, yeah, you probably should develop nuclear arms if you want to avoid a similar fate.
Yeah. And do you think there's going to be a false flag involved here?
I don't think so. I think that China is going to stay out of it, at least in terms of any sort of false flag operation. I don't think they want to risk something like that. I think China is concerned about provoking North Korea. They're more interested in maintaining economic ties and trying to steer them towards a direction that they would prefer. And the United States, I really don't know what purpose this serves the Trump administration, to be quite honest with you. Like, apart from just distracting attention away from all of the scandals surrounding his presidency. And I say that as someone who thinks that a lot of the scandals are just overblown nonsense, such as the alleged Russian involvement in the election. I think that's just a complete hyperbole and useless, and it's just the Democrats being bitter about the outcome of the election.
Just on your analysis there, 2017 obviously is a big year for Trump and stuff, and we haven't really spoken to him about him that much. From obviously him becoming inaugurated and to this day, has he performed better or worse than you expected?
I think he performed exactly as I predicted he would. He came up against vested interests in the state and in the economy, and almost everything that he promised his electorate he would do, such as his so-called border wall and issuing tariffs and taking a hard line against China, all of that has fallen apart. He hasn't been able to execute anything. And he's having a difficult time just keeping his own administration from issuing leaks to the media over everything. It's been a shit show, pardon my friends, but it's not, it isn't that impressive. And frankly, I don't foresee it improving at all. Like his agenda was never something that was feasible, but it sounded good and it garnered a lot of support, and I understand why it did, but it was not something that was ever going to be compatible with American capital.
Right. And obviously, Trump and the media sit sort of, they're obviously the two polar sides. And like the way I see it is, obviously, I sort of create a little story in my mind about Trump coming from obscurity of being a billionaire and trying to go against the media and having the backing of the middle class America, which is slowly eroding into poverty. And he's trying to fight against all the factions. He's trying to fight against the FBI. He's trying to fight against the media. He's trying to get things passed through, but he's struggling. That sort of narrative, I don't know whether that's been created because I'm watching too much, I don't know, Alex Jones or whatever, but that kind of romantic story still sort of sets in my mind. Are you with me with that at all, or like maybe I'm not listening to all the scandals as much and stuff like that? But I just still see the same thing of the media just attacking him on a lot of fronts, and I still see potential of Trump being kind of some strange hero. I don't know why, but I can still see that happening.
The problem that I have with the maverick narrative that InfoWars and a lot of people on the alt-right that like Trump espouse, it assumes that Trump really cares about these things, and I don't think he does. I think he's indifferent to it. I don't view him as a champion of the causes that he rhetorically supported during his campaign. I think he knew how to tap into popular discontent, but I don't think he ever really cared about those issues. Maybe he did mildly, but not to the extent that he'd really put his life on the line to see them through.
Do you know what I think? I think there's a thing about. I think his ego's massive. I think probably he may even have probably one of the biggest egos in the world. But I think that in some ways it may serve people in a way, in the sense that he obviously he's getting, as he is in his 70s now, he may be thinking about his legacy, and he likes that sort of the trophy of being the man, the great sort of the changer and all those kind of things. And I feel like he may try and put his ego's driving in him bigger than his own self feelings, because his ego's so big that he wants to create this major legacy in America.
Yeah, I'm sure that's definitely something that animates him. I know that he's very egotistical, but I think gaining the presidency was already a vanity project for him. So he achieved that. Yeah. That's something that'll boost his ego. We all know that he desperately cares about how people view him.
Yeah.
But as opposed to really fighting out these entrenchable battles over things like the border wall, like the Israeli-Palestinian question, like North Korea, like the wars in the Middle East, as opposed to really seeing them through, what I've noticed out of Trump is something different, and it ultimately reduces to self-deception. So what he does is he takes on really trivial situations and matters. So take, for instance, his decision to move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem instead of Tel Aviv. Like, that's that's incendiary, but it's a very minor move. In his mind, he thinks that he's deluded himself into thinking that that's a grand gesture and that's something that's going to really matter in his legacy. I think he's fooling himself that these little victories that he's winning mean more than they really do.
Yeah.
So And I think that he doesn't have the courage or the interest to really fight out the battles that people care about.
Mm.
Just like this tax bill, like the tax bill that recently passed. I mean, it has definite ramifications, to be sure. But he's convinced himself that this is going to be good for economic growth, when in actuality, all it's going to do is give a tax break to corporations. And um, those are part of his part of his support base. But really, it's not going to do anything to bolster economic growth in the United States. I mean, that's the effective tax rate has always been low here. The formal tax rate is irrelevant because of all the loopholes that businesses have always taken advantage of. So, again, in his mind, this is a huge achievement, and I think he has an interest in doing that across the board.
Yeah. Well, everybody's political career ends in tragedy, don't they? So, how would you see that Trump is going to continue on for 2018 and further?
I just see more of the same for the rest of his administration, his duration in office. It's just going to be more hawkish, saber rattling, whether it be directed at North Korea or elsewhere. I don't know. In 2018, he might change targets. He's already been posturing against Venezuela, small time countries that are of no strategic importance to the United States, but it rallies his base and they like that.
Yep.
Yeah, more of these trivial policy pursuits that aren't really going to do much of anything except stroke his ego and convince himself that he's doing something. And that's about it. That's all I foresee.
Yeah, I mean, I see, like, in some ways, it kind of reminds me of my old father in some ways, the way he acts, and he runs off of his ego a little bit. And that's probably one sense where I can romanticize with how he's portrayed and stuff like that. But in another sense, I can see when I try and analyze it with a clear mind and try and think about things, I always start to go, okay, where does he stand on, like, why is he fighting these wars? Give it up, like, get out of Middle East, get out. He said this all beforehand. Why isn't he getting out of there? He likes to pass bills which encroaches on people's privacy. I mean, why does he do that? Like, he wants to ally with Israel, and there's obviously a big load of conspiracies packed in with that one as well. So you analyze those parts and you think, okay, well, there is underhand things. Maybe he has to bargain with people to get things done, and he has to, like, I don't know, maybe he has to appease the industrial war complex to get his bill passed, and maybe he has to appease the intelligence agencies just to get one side of the intelligence agencies working on his side, and he's got to negotiate that. Maybe that's what's going on in the background, or maybe he's just a puppet, like most presidents seem to be. But when you look at those things, obviously he's not a complete hero. He's very far from it. The way I portray it is obviously like this egotistical monster is going to end up doing some good in the end. And maybe I'm sort of living in fantasy, but it is just sort of my portrayal. Maybe I've been indoctrinated in a way from it, but I just find that Trump's obviously one of the most interesting things that's ever happened to politics, and will be taught for many years in the future. But interesting times lie with the guy.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why it's so easy to romanticize Trump is because the status quo elites genuinely don't like him. Like, he's too boorish, and he gives rhetorical support to projects and ambitions that they find disagreeable.
Yeah.
Like he's fueled flames that they'd rather extinguish, in other words. And that's why they dislike him. They'd rather have anyone in office but him. He's not, even though he's under the control of the system, and he's highly circumscribed in what he can or can't do. Nonetheless, they just don't like him for aesthetic reasons and for the ideological damage he's doing to the system. So that's why it's easy to romanticize him, because people that support him can point to that and say, look at all of the hostile sentiments being directed at Trump by these people, by this power elite. That must mean that he's doing something right. But it's not that. It's just that he's not part of their good old boy network, in the sense that he doesn't present himself as they would prefer. That's all it is. It's really superficial, in my opinion. But that's what really explains this. But other people, they choose a different narrative. They want to think that he's fighting the good fight. I just don't see that. I don't see any evidence of that. So that's just, again, my 2 cents.
Now, obviously, you've said that the left hasn't been doing very well at all, but is there any kind of commendable thing, or is there a person, or is there any kind of movements that you think has been quite novel for the left in 2017?
I think that all of the big names on the left that came to the fore, whether it be Jeremy Corbyn in the UK or Bernie Sanders in the United States, I have problems with both of them. And then we have Syriza in Greece, and again, I think on balance they're doing more harm than good to the left. The left, as I conceive of it, I don't view any of the aforementioned personalities or organizations as constituting the radical revolutionary left that I consider myself a part of. And I would also extend this to the Democratic Socialist Party of America, which has had a surge in membership in 2017. I think that is a big disservice to the left for a lot of reasons. And I won't, maybe one day in the future we can delve into that. It's a story unto itself. But I don't see any signs of optimism from the major news items related to leftism in 2017. I think that all of them are going to do more harm than good for the project that I'm interested in advancing.
So it's been a very dismal year for Marxism in 2017.
Yeah, I think so. I think that in terms of the economy and where capitalism is headed, that presents us with a lot of potential for an ascendant Marxist communist movement to emerge. I just don't see any signs of it. For my part, I've been so preoccupied just trying to survive that I haven't even had an opportunity to participate in correcting that. But I hope to eventually, and I hope that in 2018 we start seeing signs of organizations and individuals of merit on the revolutionary left. But as far as 2017 is concerned, I mark that as a loss for my political philosophy.
Another question that just comes, like that Hollywood is always acclaimed to be left. You've got to be left wing to get into Hollywood and stuff, and support the narrative of the left. How comes there hasn't been really political actors coming out of Hollywood to create movements in the left? It's very strange how that's never really happened in that way.
I think the most important thing to always bear in mind when we hear the terms left and right is usually both of them are confined to the left and right of capital, meaning different management techniques for capitalism. So some progressives think that the best way to manage capitalism is through their social democratic reforms and paternalism. And then the right wing thinks that the best way to manage capital is to have limited state involvement in the marketplace and broadly conservative cultural values. And in that sense, the mainstream media and Hollywood are left of capital. There's not a lot of actors or actresses that are anti-capitalist. There's probably a couple here and there. I think that none of them are explicit about it, but I get the sense that a couple of them are. But they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to come out and say, "Oh, by the way, I'm a communist," because they fear that that's going to jeopardize their acting prospects moving forward. So I think that prevents a lot of them. Sometimes when they become of old age, you notice them come out more explicitly. So one person that comes to mind is the singer Harry Belafonte. He was a really popular like calypso singer in the 1960s, 70s, lesser extent to the 80s. He's a socialist and he's very explicit about it. But again, he's old, and the only time he really became involved in it is once he got out of the industry. So we might see that here and there on the margins, but it's weird. We live in a country in the United States where, on the one hand, people are fascinated with celebrities and their lifestyles and this and that, but on the other hand, they detest all of their opinions on anything political. It's bizarre. I never have made sense of it. I mean, to be fair, there's nothing in particular about an actor or actress that, gives them credentials to have any authority when it comes to political or economic analysis. But nevertheless, I think part of it is that it's this champagne socialist critique that I'm sort of sympathetic to, but it's sort of a logical fallacy where people are not willing to listen to someone issue criticisms of the economy that enrich them. So whether it's a famous athlete or an actress or a politician who happens to be wealthy, if they're critical of the system, people treat that with contempt because they're beneficiaries of that same system. So they're sort of inherently suspicious of that sort of thing.
Yeah, the one person I always think about who does try to argue, but he doesn't necessarily get into the gritty of finance and the money and the oppression and things like that. And obviously, I think because he's a very wealthy person now, he doesn't. It's very difficult for him to in a sense, because you're going to just get slapped back. But Russell Brand, he does try to put out the arguments of the left, and not even the left politicians really do that. He will say that there is oppression happening here, and like, why do we have a lifestyle like this where this is happening? The real grassroots arguments of the left, he will put them out. I can see that's probably like the only example that I can ever see of like a comedian who's got the looks, he's got the profile that can sort of speak, but he probably won't even go. There's probably a small chance he might go into politics, but there's only like very few people like that I can't even really mention or think about that of really doing anything.
Yeah, Russell Brand stands out because he's an exception to the rule. Like he actually has. I listen to his podcast sometimes. He's interviewed a couple of Marxist intellectuals like David Harvey. He'll occasionally call out capitalism by name as a problem. And people genuinely like Russell Brand because he's amusing and personable, and he's someone that resonates with a lot of viewers. So he's an asset to the extent he identifies with the left, but his his personal political philosophy is so incoherent that he's not that much of a threat. He incorporates a lot of spiritualism and things that aren't really a threat to the status quo, and that's probably why he's tolerated by the media establishment, because he's so hard to pin down and because he's not that committed to any particular um, program of political philosophy.
Yeah,
He's sort of all over.
and it becomes very difficult when you're so wealthy as well, doesn't it? Being a leftist.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, yeah. I would. I mean, from what I gather from Russell Brand, is he would be. He's the sort of person that, even though he's wealthy, he would be content with a more modest lifestyle. Like, I don't think he's that concerned with consumerism. Um, but at the same time, it really depends how far you can push that logic. He lives comfortably, so if someone were to show up and confiscate his wealth, who knows how he would react? There's no telling.
Right, and so for 2018, what's going to be the story for the left?
I'm hoping, this is my optimism, which is very limited, but I'm hoping that a few individuals of merit emerge that can start steering the popular discontent in a productive direction. I think we need to have a better social media profile. There's a lot of work to be done, and I'm hoping that it starts germinating in 2018. I'm not under any illusions that revolution is on the horizon, or that that's going to be the year that things really turn around. I'm just hopeful that we'll start seeing the seeds of that start come to fruition. But if that doesn't occur, I think the current trajectory of leftism is going to continue to embolden the alternative right further.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in my mind, I still think that I'm still probably way off the mark in terms of immediacy. I don't think it's going to happen just yet, but I think that there's going to be a kind of fusion. There's going to be a sort of point in which we think, hold on a minute here, we've been on two opposite sides of the spectrum, but there's a lot of middle ground, and there's new technology here, and there's all these facets, and we've been played against each other, and really we actually agree on a lot of things. And I think in the future there's going to be some kind of point where there's a new system that we potentially can rely on. I'm optimistic of that point. I still think there's going to be elements of capitalism. I still think there could be elements of a communist, socialist system that actually benefits society as a whole. But it still enables individualism and ingenuity, and it does have a sense of community and all the goodness that is provided within that as well. So that's my take, but I still think we're looking at the breakdown of middlemen next year. We're looking down at the breakdown of corruption. We're looking at the breakdown of sex scandals. This is the crux of the problem. Obviously, things have continued on for ages, but I think everyone's sort of pinning that 2018 is going to be the year of the new crisis. But with cryptos and the incorruptibility, it's going to be the new shoots of capitalism. It's going to be the new way that I think is going to be shown to the world. And I think that's going to be the significant event in 2018. And I think there's you can see that there's going to be still more issues with terrorism and the problems with that. And obviously we mentioned about there's going to be some very big, there has to be somebody that is going to exploit these very vulnerable times with people that have been told a story all of their life, which is going to go crumbling around them. Those people who are very susceptible are going to be swept up by somebody who's going to tell them things that they want to hear in the moment, but may not necessarily be the truth. Or there may be some people that will be able to tell them the truth and they get support. But I think you and I both agree that the 2018 is going to have some very interesting orators that are going to appear out of nowhere.
Absolutely. I hope you're right that we see a reduction in abuse, oppression, and parasitism. And I really hope that we don't see the rise of a new class of demagogues that channel all of the righteous discontent that's emerging in the wrong directions. But I'm looking forward to analyzing it with you in the months ahead. We'll see what happens.
Yeah. Anything else you want to throw in there? Is there anything else that you can think of that we've missed? Maybe, I don't know. Maybe, do you think this is one thing that just popped into my head? Obviously, I don't know that you may have been a bit hit with it, but what about conditions like in the earth and volcanoes and a lot of weather patterns which have been happening? Do you think that they're on the increase, or do you think that's just a phenomenon that's always been happening?
I'm I know that a lot of people tend to associate environmentalism with leftism these days. I'm not of that school of thought. I've always been skeptical of sort of the alarmism and sensationalism that people employ when it comes to that. When it comes to weather patterns, I'm completely agnostic. I do think that global warming is a measurable phenomena, and I do think that mankind is contributing to it, and that might have some kind of a causal link towards the extreme weather patterns we've observed in 2017. But I also think that the sort of radical adjustment that a lot of environmentalists claim needs to happen is overblown. I think that new technologies are going to go a long way in reducing our carbon emissions. And I even see that happening under capitalism. I think a lot of radical leftists have opportunistically attached themselves to this green movement, and they try to attach ecological concerns with anti-capitalism in the sense that they argue that the only way we can get out of this ecocide is if we transition to a communist mode of production or whatever. I disagree with that. I don't think that's the case. I think that innovations that are occurring right now in the bourgeois epoch are probably going to go a long way in addressing this. So I've never attached my leftism to environmentalism at all. I think that it's entirely irrelevant to that goal. But in terms of what you brought up, whether or not we're going to see an increase in this extreme weather, it's hard to say. I don't know.
I think there's, just like with earthquakes, there's been a lot of earthquakes recently. I don't know, is it me, or it just seems like especially like the Ring of Fire with like around the Pacific Ocean, all the states around there, you can just feel that like a lot of things have been happening over in like New Zealand and places like that. Yeah, America's on the crux of that with California and things like that. There must be a lot of tension building up there for an eruption coming, or not eruption, but some kind of land movement or an earthquake over there.
Yeah, when it comes to the causality, that's where I'm sort of agnostic. But whether or not it could be cyclical. Like, we've had extreme droughts in history. We've had massive earthquakes and tornadoes and hurricanes and you name it, recurrent throughout human history, and let alone the history of the world. But I think that all of that can surely exacerbate existing problems that we're all facing because resources are so strained right now.
Yeah.
So in California, the wildfires that have been eviscerating that state, obviously that's putting a lot of strain on their infrastructure and their social insurance. And California was already enduring a lot of economic hardship, so that's just making life more miserable for people, and that can contribute to political activism one way or another. But I'm hesitant to say whether or not that's going to have a transformative effect in 2018. I don't know.
What's the worst thing that can happen in 2018?
I think the worst thing that could happen is, and this is going to sound a little ironic, but I think the worst thing that could happen is a resurgence of social democratic sympathies, by which I mean progressive, labor orientated politicians being able to take advantage of working class discontent and then embarking on yet another reformist agenda that inevitably fails. And then that's going to set the left back even further than it already is. Like, I think that's the last thing the left needs, is these reformist politicians coming in, mismanaging capitalism and calling it leftism. That to me would be a nightmare come true.
Right. And I don't know, as a leftist, what would your key recommendations of things that you should be doing and thinking about in 2018?
I think anyone interested in a anti-capitalist, communist political project needs to immediately get out of any sort of political party apparatus, such as the Democratic Socialists of America. I think that participating in parliamentary politics is a mistake. I think what needs to be done is the hard work of establishing workers' councils in communities across Western countries and start educating working people on the causes of the problems that they already acknowledge in their daily lives. That is a really hard process, and very few people have the tenacity to see it through. But I think that if people are genuinely committed to that, that's what they need to be engaging in right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think 2018 may be a year where ideas and the propaganda and the way people have been indoctrinated is going to be shattered. And I think it's just the best thing is just to keep yourself on the tap of things. Look at things like the bond market. Look at how that might manifest and turn into something dangerous. Think about how cryptos are playing out. Think about how liquid you are and how your cash flow is going. I think they're all interesting things that you need to be looking at your community, what's your backup plan, all of those things. I think that's probably the most important things to do in 2018, just before the curtain closes on a system which is probably is reaching its final days.
I concur with that. That's a well way of encapsulating that.
All right, I think we might have been going for a record here. I think we'll draw this one to a close. Thank you very much again, Michael. And where can people find you?
People can find my writings and previous recordings you and I have made at my website, which is commonruin.wordpress.com. I'm also working with a organization of Marxist theory called the Friedrich Engels Institute of Scientific Socialist Research. And I'm currently trying to make some progress towards organizing a new council communist political organization in the United States. That's in the distant future. That's not anywhere near being launched. But if people are interested, they can contact me through my email address that you can find at the URL I cited. Also, I just want to apologize to any listeners in advance if I was incoherent or a little sloppy speaking. I got off of work before we started. I'm a little tired. And if anyone heard a cat during this recording, that's my girlfriend's cat. So please accept my sincere apologies for that one.
Oh, that's fine. Okay, all right. Well, thanks again, and we'll be in contact for the new year.
All right, sounds good. Have a nice new year, Charles. I appreciate it.
No worries. Thanks.